We're going to go and currently discuss Unit 5, which is going to be all about electrolyte balance and acid-base balance.
This program will discuss imbalances in some of the main electrolytes in the body. The electrolyte balance in the body's fluids is absolutely crucial to many body processes, and any imbalances can cause serious disorders and can even be life-threatening. As described in an earlier program, the fluids in the body are filled with dissolved salts and minerals that take on plus or minus electrical charges and are called ions or electrolytes. The common electrolytes sodium, potassium, and calcium take on positive charges in a fluid and are called cations. And chloride, bicarbonate, and phosphate take on negative charges and are called anions. The concentrations and charges of these electrolytes have a lot to do with how fluids move through the body and how they pass through the membranes into and out of cells and blood vessels. Osmosis, diffusion, and active transport are all processes of fluid transfer through membranes that are dependent on the concentrations of electrolytes. Imbalances in electrolytes can disrupt this flow of fluids and cause many pathological conditions. The body's cells feed themselves, rid themselves of wastes, and send and receive chemical substances from all around the body. Much of this complex fluid transportation network is controlled by electrolytes and how they influence the movement of fluids through membranes. First, we will discuss sodium.
So, electrolyte regulation. As the video previously that you just watched said, electrolytes are essentially those things that when exposed into water, they dissociate and become ions, and ions are either positively or negatively charged atoms. And so an electrolyte balance exists when the quality of the electrolytes that the body gains equals those that are lost. And so how does this input and output equal each other? Well, we take things like food, fluids, or even metabolic reactions. All of these things essentially in some way or another can produce ions. You can take, for instance, sodium chloride. Whenever you dissolve that salt into water, becomes the ion, the sodium ion, which is positive, and the chloride ion, which is negative. And you can take salt in things like food or fluids, right? You drink a Gatorade, there's going to be plenty of electrolytes in there. You eat food or you salt your food or anything, you're going to have those there. And essentially metabolic reactions can cause these as well. So all of those are our main source of electrolyte intake. And essentially we can get rid of electrolytes to balance our body through perspiration. If you've ever taken a run or been outside, sometimes you can lick your lips and you can taste that saltiness around your lips, and essentially that's because you can lose electrolytes through sweat. You can get rid of it through feces or fecal matter and urine. So what do you think are important electrolytes that in the body based on previous lectures? So we've talked about some of these, but essentially important electrolytes in your body, and there are more than these, but these are the main ones, are sodium, potassium, and calcium. So the regulation of these three ions are extremely important. Sodium is important when we get later in this semester talking about how nerve cells communicate back and forth with each other. So that's really important in things like impulse conduction along an axon or membrane permeability. So an axon is a part of a nerve cell, and membrane permeability is the ease for which molecules and ions can move back and forth across the membrane. So sodium is important in all of these. Potassium is important in maintaining the resting potential of a nerve or cardiac muscle cells. So resting potential is essentially what the electrical current is across the membrane when it's not doing anything. And potassium is really important in maintaining that. Sodium and potassium work together to allow neuronal cells to communicate through things called action potentials. And all this we're going to learn in the last few units of this 8-week course. And calcium, you'll find out, is important in a couple things. It's important in neurotransmitter release. So how does one nerve cell talk to the next? Well, they release neurotransmitters that diffuse across the space between the two nerve cells and then essentially allow the next one to know something's happening. So calcium's important in that, but it's also important in muscle contraction, which we'll learn here in a few weeks. So electrolytes are extremely important in just producing these physiological changes in our body. Now, we have basically intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. So if you remember from the last one, intracellular fluid is that fluid that essentially you're going to find inside a cell, and extra is outside the cell. So when you're looking outside the cell, and this is essentially interstitial fluid, which is a fluid that you see that bathes tissues, or essentially fluid, extracellular fluid, as you know, can be plasma or in the essentially component of blood. So in there, you're going to find ions like sodium or chlorine, calcium, or basically bicarbonate. Now, inside, you'll find things like potassium, right? Phosphorus, magnesium, and sulfur. So these are essentially important electrolytes that are in and outside your cell. So our body essentially can figure out or warn us when we're running low on electrolytes. And so when we want to intake more electrolytes, essentially what our body does, it causes us to either be thirsty or hungry. And when that happens, we are going to go and find those things that we have a deficit of, and we're going to eat them. So that's essentially a severe electrolyte deficiency can be characterized by a craving of whatever substance because your body truly, truly needs that. So if you start craving really salty foods, essentially your body is deficit in sodium chloride or sodium and chloride ions. Now, deficits can cause, or excess of electrolytes can cause some issues. So hypernatremia is basically talking about how our body, or sodium regulation, or a condition of high sodium concentration, right? And so when we're looking at this hyper, just like hyperactivity means more, and then I look in here and there's this Na, and if you know, the Na basically denotes what sodium is. So hypernatremia is a condition of high sodium levels, right? High concentration of sodium. Now, essentially, sodium is regulated by the hormone aldosterone. So when we're talking about this, hypernatremia can be caused by a few things, and I'm going to go ahead and put this whiteboard up here again to make it a little bit easier to see. So hypernatremia can be characterized or caused by dehydration. So essentially in dehydration, you've lost water, but you're not losing sodium, So the sodium is becoming more and more concentrated because you're losing the water. Of course, fever can cause dehydration or even complications of disease. So a perfect disease that causes this is Cushing's disease. And we'll learn a little bit more about Cushing's disease or syndrome. Let me actually put is more indicative of it. So Cushing's syndrome is essentially happens when you have a high level of cortisol. And we'll talk about this a little bit more whenever we get into the endocrine system. And cortisol essentially acts kind of in your body like a diuretic. A diuretic, if you've ever heard anybody trying to lose weight for weight loss, sometimes they'll do this because it essentially allows you to get rid of water. But at the time it's getting rid of water, it's blocking sodium to be released. So that essentially increases the amount of sodium in the body. There is essentially no effective way to really lower sodium high sodium concentrations by the body. The only one that it really has is just basically increasing water intake. It also at times will try to flush, and the reason why you increase water intake, the more water you have in the body, the more water your body is going to release through urine. So it's a way to help kind of flush high sodium levels. And so if you go to the doctor, they're going to essentially try to use this mechanism to get rid of high sodium, right? And so they may ask you to take something like a diuretic while drinking lots of water to try to allow this flushing to happen faster, right? And so there are some hormones that you can take to help with getting rid of essentially, or to help with retention. So essentially when you're looking, progesterone, this can actually lower sodium retention. But you have to watch because things like estrogen or glucocorticoids can actually increase sodium retention. So hormones have a lot to do with this whole process. Now, what do you think it's called if we have hypernatremia, this higher sodium concentration? What do you think it is called if you have lower sodium concentration? You'd be right if you said hyponatremia. So, with hyponatremia, basically this is low sodium concentrations, and in essentially both of these are in the extracellular fluid. So the causes of this are things like water intoxication that can happen. Prolonged water electrolyte loss due to fever. Vomiting or diarrhea. or renal disease. Now, essentially, when we're talking about before, we had a syndrome, Cushing syndrome, that helped to increase the concentration of sodium in the body. Well, here there's something called Addison's disease. And this essentially can cause changes in blood pressure and blood volume, and essentially change the amount of sodium there. And this all affects the adrenal gland hormones. So when the body is trying to detect sodium concentrations, it's essentially detected by the macula densa cells that are in the kidney. And what they're going to do is they're going to release renin. And renin essentially is a molecule that's part of what's known as the renin angiotensin system. And essentially renin is going to allow for the ultimate, it's going to trigger and allow for the ultimate release of aldosterone. And this comes from the adrenal gland. So what is this? Well, aldosterone essentially is going to signal the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium into the blood. So it's basically just a signaling cascade, right? If aldosterone is not regulated quite right, then essentially that is going to cause a change of whether you have low or high sodium levels. And you can see here signs and symptoms. You can start getting kind of where you don't have a lot of energy or lethargic. You can get headache, confusion, maybe apprehension to making decisions because you're confused, and seizures, and essentially hyponatremia can lead to coma. A lot of times what they're looking for when serum sodium is less than about 135. And we essentially talked about all the different ways that it can happen.
Athletes, listen up. Have you ever heard of hyponatremia? It's a rare condition, but one that you need to know about. The condition involves drinking way too much water, so much water that it depletes sodium and dilutes your blood. Now the results, seizures, coma, even death. Dr. Don Wilbur, the medical director of Global Health, joins us to talk about it. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, so what is hyponatremia?
Hyponatremia, what you were talking about is salt, or sodium of salt. And it's an electrolyte. Like your blood carries lots of electrolytes. That's part of the way we function. It carries all kinds of other things, proteins, fats, blood cells to carry oxygen, and so forth. Well, the sodium is very important as far as the function of your body. And if you lower the sodium level in your blood, then things don't function well, and that's when you get into the lethargy, cramps, even seizures, and even death. So you don't want to let your sodium level drop. The way it's dropping, what we're talking about here is in athletes, is by diluting it too much. I take in too much regular water and I dilute the sodium so the sodium level drops thus hypo.
Okay.
So hyponatremia is a low sodium level, and it can be very injurious. It happens in these athletes that are participating in the sports and maybe losing some electrolytes or maybe over drinking. And the other place it happens is in these contests that people have where they drink lots of water. And that can happen with them too. There've been different contests on radio stations where they drank a lot of water and people have had a bad outcome. Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about consuming too much water. How do you know if too much is too much?
Well, all things in moderation. I mean, you don't go out and drink a gallon of water. I mean, nobody would do that.
Right.
So what seems normal? And once again, we're talking about the only people that are at risk are people that are doing 4-hour marathons, not a child that goes out and plays an hour sport or the guy that goes out and mows his lawn. Those people are more likely to get just regular dehydration. I lose too much fluid and realize sweat is dilute. There's not really a lot of salt in sweat, so you're not losing a lot of salt. You're losing more water, so you replenish that with just regular water.
Okay.
One of the things we always worry about as pediatricians with sports drinks is there's always been way too much sugar in the sports drinks.
Yeah.
And so people that get into, I drink Gatorade, this is good for my kids, it's a sports drink. Well, no, it's not. It's not really good. Water is a lot better in general for kids.
What if you have like water and maybe you add a few pretzels every now and then if you're going to be doing something for extended periods of time? Is that enough salt?
Yeah, you're loading up on salts ahead of time. Eat some salted peanuts, eat some pretzels, something like that, and you get a little bit of salt ahead of time. Once again, all things in moderation. I don't think you're going to take way too much salt. It'd make you sick.
So use some common sense either way.
Yeah.
Perfect note. Use some common sense anyway. Anyway. So that kind of gives you an idea with that. Hyponatremia tends to be a problem with people thinking that, like he said, doing lots of running or being outside for long periods of time and basically over-hydrating. I had a friend who did this one time because she was doing one of those ultra marathons and she just kept drinking, even though she didn't feel like she needed to. And then essentially you can get swelling in different parts, and she went momentarily blind for probably about 15 or 20 minutes because there was some pressure put on the optic nerve. So this tends to happen more so in people that are a little bit heavier. It's been known to happen more in women because they tend to pack on water or essentially kind of retain water a little bit more than men, and essentially in women who tend to be a little bit slower when they're running long distances, so it takes them longer, so they're out longer, and they feel because they're out longer they need to drink a little bit water. So it's not something that essentially happens a lot, but it's just something to be aware of. And again, this is just talking about how aldosterone essentially works. So you can see here what happens. It's kind of twofold. You have first your body, there's a reduction in sodium content. And so it's going to trigger renin to be released. And that renin essentially is going to activate this molecule called angiotensin II. Now what angiotensin II does is it comes through the bloodstream and it's going to activate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Now aldosterone is going to come here and target the kidney tubules, and from there essentially it's going to help to increase sodium reabsorption, and then basically it has potassium being secreted. And then at this point, these guys work together to help restore this imbalance. Now, what also happens is most times you'll notice that as sodium is decreasing, the concentration of potassium is increasing in that extracellular fluid. So these two mechanisms basically kind of work together to create this pathway that allows the sodium potassium concentrations to essentially go back into homeostasis at the end. And this is kind of a review over what you guys would have done in the last unit. Now calcium is the next. Where did it go? Sorry about that. So let's talk, I kind of moved around. I didn't realize I did that, guys. Sorry about that. The next one we're going to talk about is essentially potassium, and we kind of talked a little bit about that looking at that angiotensin pathway. So let's talk about hyperkalemia first. Again, you can help remember the words. This means high potassium levels because hyper, just like hyperactivity, means more. Do you notice there's a K in there? So that'll kind of give you an idea of how to remember this. And so essentially what we're looking at here is hyperkalemia is high potassium levels. And here, it's going to essentially be caused by renal disease, can be caused by drugs, or Addison's disease. And like I mentioned before, it can cause a lot of problems, right? And so essentially severe hyperkalemia can essentially cause severe changes in cardiac conductance. It can be life-threatening. It can potentially cause a cardiac arrest, right? And so you want to make sure that you are being smart, or if you have this problem that you're keeping it in check, because it can kill you. Again, I said it can be caused by renal failure. At times, acidosis, it can cause acidosis, which is a change in the pH of your blood, and massive tissue damage. So you kind of want to watch your potassium levels. A lot of times they'll give things like diuretic to flush extra potassium. Again, they'll want to make sure to drink a lot of water, and they'll monitor both your renal functions and respiratory status whenever they're looking at trying to manage hyperkalemia. So, and no potassium supplements if it gets too high, right? So a lot of times you don't need to take supplements that have a lot of potassium in them because it can be essentially fatal. Just kind of looking and taking just a regular multivitamin or eating stuff that's kind of high in potassium is good enough. Let me get out of here. Now, hypokalemia is essentially low blood potassium concentrations. And this is caused by using diuretic drugs. Can be caused by kidney disease or extracellular pH increase, right? The thing is that your body has no way of conserving potassium. So on here, you must supply it or resupply it. It's a better way to say it. And this can be a problem because low potassium can cause things like paralysis, respiratory difficulty, severe cardiac imbalances as well. So things like arrhythmias, where it's not balancing in any kind of rhythm. So both of these potassium levels are very, very important in the body. And at any time, the great thing about this is if you're not able to keep up with me, right, just go ahead and pause it, and then, you can write down any of the notes that you need, right? And we talked about this. So the last one that we're going to talk here is calcium. And 99% of the calcium you find in your bones in the form of calcium phosphate salts. But calcium is also important in the extracellular fluid. So outside of the bones, outside of cells in general, because it's important in regulating blood clotting if you have any kind of damage or injury. And you may think, oh, well, I don't cut myself off that often, but you're getting little tears in your blood vessels all the time for which your body's fixing pretty quickly. And so for that, you need to be able to have calcium there to activate that. It's important in cell permeability, being able to secrete things, things like neurotransmitters, and being able to have neuromuscular excitability or be able to contract your muscles, basically, which is one of the most important mechanisms. So hypercalcemia, you can see again hyper, and if you look, it has the Cl there, right? So this is essentially high calcium levels in the blood. And this can be bad because high calcium levels in the blood can essentially inhibit muscle contractions. If you're inhibiting muscle contractions, that's signaling danger for heart muscles. So you have to be very careful. Now, this can be caused by something known as hyperparathyroidism. And this is essentially an excess secretion of PTH, which is a hormone. Particularly, it's called parathyroid hormone. And this essentially increases things like blood absorption or reabsorption. I said blood, I meant bone, sorry. And cancer. So, serious condition. Now, hypocalcemia is low levels of calcium in the blood. And so this can be a problem because it can increase neuron excitability. Increased neurons that are excited can signal to muscle cells. And so essentially, this can lead to a process. Let me go. TETANY, muscle tetany, which is essentially whenever you see the like muscle twitches. And that's because you need calcium there to inhibit muscle contraction. So with this in mind, this is caused by a reduction in PTH or parathyroid hormone. It can also be caused by vitamin D deficiencies, gastrointestinal surgery, and basically excess calcium being released from the kidneys. So how do we fix this? Well, it can be treated with administering calcium salts and high doses of vitamin D. And what these guys together are going to essentially help is with calcium absorption. So that's how you can get those electrolytes imbalanced. And so this kind of looks at if you have low calcium levels, essentially that's going to increase parathyroid hormone release from the parathyroid. That's those little guys that are right there, right? And that's going to, how it's going to increase calcium in the blood is by threefold. It's going to first activate these things called osteoclast. Osteo is going to go for bone. That's, think osteoporosis, right? It's talking about the breakdown of bones. So osteo is a term used in that field. And clast here is going to tell us about the type of cells that are there. So osteoclast or cells, clast cells, are ones that break down things. So osteoclast activity in the bones here are going to start breaking down the bones, and essentially you're going to get a release of calcium and these phosphate ions. So calcium is going to then be released into the blood. The second thing, so that's the first thing that PTH helps with. The second thing here is basically it helps activate in the kidney tubules the reabsorption of calcium itself. And the third thing here is essentially an increase the activation of vitamin D by kidneys, which will help with the absorption of calcium from the food in the small intestines. So all of these together are going to essentially help to raise calcium levels in the blood. You can see this right here is essentially the initial stimulus that happens. All the green here are the physiological responses your body enacts to change the situation, and thus the yellow here is the result. So that's how parathyroid works on the bones, the kidneys, and the intestines in combination to increase calcium levels. Now, as we've talked with electrolytes, we've talked about acidosis happening in an example earlier. And acidosis is the changing your body's pH from near neutral to being acidic. So acid-base regulation in our body is really, really important, especially considering if we can't regulate it, then we're going to start degrading or what's called denaturing, which is the falling apart of important things like proteins. So acids will release what type of electrolytes? So what I want you guys to think, when we were in lab, we talked about electrolytes. We talked about reactions specifically here. So we have hydrochloric acid here, right? And we put it in water. And what happened? If you said it dissociated into the hydrogen ion and the chloride ion, you would be right. And what's important about this, it asks, is acids release what electrolyte? And here, when we're talking about acid-base balance, we're concerned with the fact it releases hydrogens. And that hydrogen is going to change the pH. Now, if you remember in lab when we talked about bases, I gave you this example of sodium hydroxide. And in water, it dissociates into two components. What are they? You would be right if you said sodium and then the hydroxyl. Right? And so the hydroxyl essentially here is what the base donates, what kind of electrolyte. Because remember, this right here is going to combine with a hydrogen to make water, and then essentially it's going to help to neutralize. But it releases these hydroxyl ions. So why is it important that our body regulates hydrogen? Because that's what's going to change how many hydrogens are there or how little is going to change the pH of our body. And why is that important? And like I said, hydrogen ions, right? It's kind of a double here, can affect proteins, right? It can make them basically fall apart. And proteins, for the most part, are enzymes. They're also structural formations, right? But they're enzymes, so basically it can reduce enzyme function by breaking and destroying the enzymes. So the normal pH in a person is between 7.35 to 7.45. And our body is going to work really, really, really hard to regulate that, to keep it within that. And so the sources of hydrogen ions within our body are thus. You can get them some from aerobic respiration of glucose and anaerobic. So when we're talking about aerobic respiration, that's when we're talking about cellular respiration. And if you remember, there were all those hydrogen ions that essentially they would use by breaking down. They'd make NADH and then go over and break down NADH into NAD plus and H's, and those hydrogens could be used to pump across the membrane to activate ATP synthase, right? So all of that can come together and essentially make a thing called carbonic acid. And if you remember in here, carbonic acid is made because when you're working out or you're running, you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out what? Hopefully you said carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide on top of all those hydrogens that we were using earlier. Let me see if I can. Oops. Right? That's one of the waste products of anaerobic respiration. And combined with water makes carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid essentially can go into and create excess hydrogens. Now, anaerobic, if you're working out and you can't get enough oxygen to your system, say for instance you're running, you're a new runner, you haven't done it ever in a very long time, and you go run, and then the next day you wake up sore. And it's essentially because if you have enough oxygen, you take glucose at the beginning, and then you go through glycolysis, right? And then you make pyruvate, and there you go through that intermediate step from making pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Then you go to the last stage, and you take acetyl-CoA through the electron transport chain to make ATP. And this keeps going as long as you have oxygen. Well, this is with O2, right? If you do not have O2, you start with glucose and you make pyruvate, right? All this needs oxygen. We still need to make ATP though, right? You're running from a bear. The bear's not going to stop chasing you so that you can stop, catch your breath so you can make ATP to keep going. So your body is going to kind of do some backup to it to make sure you're okay. So what it's going to do essentially is make a whole other pathway so that you can keep going over this glycolysis over and over and over again. So it kind of makes this big circle. But the process of this, which is called fermentation, right? Here it's called anaerobic respiration. It's going to essentially make lactic acid. So when you're running the next day you're sore, it's because you've built up lactic acid in your muscle, and that lactic acid has damaged your muscle in some way, and so now your body's going to have to prepare it or repair it. And so, and the more you get, the more you work out, the less of this happens and the more of this happens, which is why over time you don't have sore muscles. Now, there's this whole incomplete oxidation of fatty acids. So whenever you're breaking down, you don't have enough glucose, you start breaking down fatty acids. This is a part of a lipid, right? Then you're going to make these things called ketone bodies, which essentially can combine and make these or increase the hydrogen concentration in there. And a perfect ketone here is, think acetone. And so if you have uncontrolled diabetes, this is a process that you'll go through, and this is what leads to that ketoacidosis that happens. And this happens shortly in ketosis. You can break down sulfur-containing amino acids, and these are all in lieu, essentially, of not being able sometimes to make energy this way. And so you can make sulfuric acid or phosphoric acid from breaking down either amino acids or nucleic acids. And this, if you remember, is part of DNA. These are part of proteins. So all of this is where you can get these internal sources of hydrogen. So in order for our body to maintain the right pH, it's very important for us to regulate it. And we regulate them by either what's known as chemical buffer systems, this is the first, respiratory centers in our body, or renal mechanisms. So respiratory centers, you can think here, your lungs, and here, your kidneys. And here, this is chemicals that are going to be automatically in your blood and interstitial fluid. So all of these are essentially ways that we regulate pH. So the chemical buffer systems, they're actually in the blood, so that should make you realize those are going to be the first and the most rapid way of trying to mediate pH change. Now, it's going to take a few moments for your body to realize your pH is going up and then tell someone out of that situation to change it, right? Think about this in the terms of an office building. If I come right now and I'm sitting in my office and all of a sudden a pipe burst in the wall, then if I have something that I can try to fix it with immediately, then that's going to be what happens first. That's kind of analogous to the chemical buffer system because that's right there. It's what's in the blood. It's what's in the interstitial fluid. It's molecules that are there that are going to try to change it immediately. But if I can't fix it immediately, it's a big enough problem, then I'm going to call somebody to come down. That's why you can see the brainstem respiratory centers, why they say they act between 1 and 3 minutes, because it's going to take a few minutes for the body to realize that there's a pH change. And then the last one, and that's, think, you're breathing constantly. So that's going to be the first one that gets activated. Well, you're not going to the restroom constantly. I mean, you couldn't survive if every, a minute or so you had to go to the bathroom, right? You'd be losing too much fluid. But just think how terrible that would make your life. And so on here, renal mechanisms, or your kidney, has the most potential of changing the pH in your body, but it's going to require hours to days to affect this to basically change and affect the pH. So this is going to be once the person, say if there's a problem in my office, I'm going to call the maintenance here to fix it. But then later they're going to actually if it's going to require a huge change, then they're going to hire, say, a plumber to come in here or some other mechanisms that is going to have more potential of changing and fixing that. So those are kind of the different stages, and to give you an idea of what's the best. So when we're talking about these, let's start with the first, which is the chemical buffer system. Okay. So buffers. What are buffers? Well, buffers are those things that are going to help to stabilize pH, right? So what are good buffers? Weak acids and weak bases make good buffers. Think, if a buffer is something that's trying to prevent pH change, then a weak acid or a weak base is going to be something that's not a really strong or something that has a pH that's on the ends of the pH scale. So we don't want something to be a strong acid. Oops, sorry, let me do this. Weak. Sorry. We don't want something that's going to be strong. So like the two acids and bases I've talked about so far, when we talk about hydrochloric acid, that's a strong acid. Things are called strong acids because they dissociate completely in water, which means they completely separate into H and Cl. And if they completely separate, that's going to make them a very strong acid. It's going to make it a pH of 2 because there are a lot of hydrogens there, and that can drastically or dramatically affect the pH. The same thing in a strong base. It completely associates. So it's going to be able to tie up all the hydrogens that come out. So that's going to be on the opposite end. If you're trying to make sure that a pH isn't changing a lot, you don't want something that can drastically change your pH. Thus, the reason why buffers are good if they're weak acids and weak bases. It means they only partially dissociate in water, right? So if it's a little bit of a basic, right, they're going to provide a little bit of hydrogens if they're weak acid. If they're a weak base, they're going to accept the hydrogens a little bit more slowly. There's not as many OHs there to take them in. So that's going to make sure to kind of, slowly change and keep stuff at a reasonable constant pH. So this is kind of giving you an idea, right? What's considered strong acid and strong bases. So when we look at this, hydrochloric acid, you see, you have all of these hydrogens here. So this is going to drastically change the pH. Where here, carbonic acid is a weak acid. This is the one that we get from CO2 and water, right? So when you go down here, you're going to see a lot of them that are still complete, and then you see this, which is bicarbonate. And then this, which is hydrogen. And so weak acid and weak bases, they're going to just be they don't dissociate completely, which is going to make them a better buffer. So when we're talking about buffers, or what are good buffers, chemical buffers help to regulate ion concentration by combining with excess hydrogens when the pH is too low or releasing hydrogens when the pH is too high. So these are not going to be strong acids and strong bases. So there's a few of them that are really good here. You have the bicarbonate buffer system, which you can see here. Right? You have the phosphate buffer system, and then you have proteins that are there, and they are amphoteric, which means that they basically have positive and negative on both of them. So they're good. So how this works, and I can just show you more for you to look at so you can understand how they work versus me testing you exactly on this. When you have the bicarbonate, you have this carbon dioxide and water coming together, right? And these mean that they can go this way or that way. That's what that means. And so they come together to form carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid comes and produces bicarbonate and a hydrogen. So, and this means that this is another reason why they're good, that this carbonic acid will go this way, and then it also comes back and reforms. So it goes back and forth. But this can accept hydrogens, right? And this is releasing them. So that's how it makes a good buffer. So that is the bicarbonate buffer system. That's the first one, right? The second one is this. You have this phosphate, right? And so essentially how this works is that they can dissociate into here. So this accepts, this donates. So that's a phosphate. And how these guys look right? This is what an amino acid looks like here. So this is the center part. This is what changes when we're talking about amino acids. So the R group is what changes, but every amino acid, and this is what's called the alpha carbon, and this is the carboxyl group, and this is the amine group. So basically what happens, I'm going to do it this way so I have enough room, is if you look over here on this side, this guy's positive. So this is the acid form of a protein. And then basically what can happen is that in the blood or in your body, it can go to this, and you can see over here you have this negative part, and this essentially is the neutral form, right? And then this can further go into negative HR. This, which is the base form. So that's what it means by amphoteric, is that it can go back and forth like this. Sorry, it's all so messy here. That you basically have positive and negative in both sides, and that it can act as an acid and a base. So this is another way that essentially we use this. And so where are these important? The bicarbonate system happens in your blood. Oops. Right? The phosphate buffer system is in so this is extracellular, right? With the blood. This is intracellular in the sense you can find it most often in urine. And the protein buffer system can be found in essentially in the plasma in the blood and the intracellular fluid as well. So just a reminder, bicarbonate is found in the blood, right? The phosphate buffer is primarily found in urine and the intracellular fluid, and the protein buffer system is essentially in the plasma and the intracellular fluid. Now, those were chemical buffers. Now, the physiological buffers are essentially the respiratory and the renal system. And they're going to regulate the amount of acid and base that's in the body. They act more slowly, like I said before, than chemical buffer systems, but they have more capacity than chemical buffer systems, which means they can change things more, right? So these guys essentially work together to help change pH that the chemical buffer system couldn't get a hold of. So the respiratory regulations and how this works, this is going to control hydrogen or get rid of it by the rate of breathing. So essentially what you see here is that cells increase the production of CO2. And and a lot of times this is through metabolism, Just to let you know, right? CO2 comes together with water, and that produces the carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, as you remember, can release hydrogens, and this hydrogen will stimulate the respiratory systems to activate. And essentially, depending on what's there, it can increase the rate and depth of breathing. The deeper you breathe, the faster you breathe, more O2 is going to be eliminated through your lungs. So essentially, the respiratory systems that are centers that are regulated are in the medulla. That's where you're going to find that. And they do it by basically detecting CO2. So when you're running and you're breathing harder, you're thinking you're breathing harder because your body needs more oxygen. But in actuality, you're breathing harder because you're producing more carbon dioxide and your body doesn't want to change the pH. So then they are getting rid of CO2. The renal regulation works this way. So essentially here, we are trying to excrete hydrogen ions through urine, right? So essentially what happens is here, if you take in a high intake of proteins, what can happen is you can increase the metabolism of amino acids, and then a lot of times with here, you're going to increase the amount of sulfuric and phosphoric acids that you're getting, right? The sulfuric acid is going to be specifically from the breakdown of amino acids. Phosphoric can as well, as long as with the breakdown of DNA. This is going to increase the concentration, again, of the hydrogen in the blood fluids. And what this is going to do, it's going to activate your renal tubules to increase the secretion of hydrogen into fluid, right, in that area. And that is going to increase the concentration of hydrogen in your urine. And that hopefully, once you release the urine with all the H, or the hydrogen ions there, that allow the concentration of hydrogens and the body fluid to return to normal, right? So all buffering systems work by interacting chemically with hydrogen ions. Is that true? Hopefully you said false, because not only do we have chemical buffer systems, right, but we have physiological buffer systems as well. Now, what is important here? Acidosis. With acidosis and alkalosis, you are getting a change in your pH. Now, acidosis is the decrease in your pH, right? Alkalosis is like alkaline or base, an increase in your pH. And so what happens here, the difference between acidosis and alkalosis is that here, if you look at the top, you're talking about you have an accumulation of acids, a loss of base that's going to increase the amount of hydrogens in your body, that's going to drop your pH, and that's what leads to acidosis. A loss of acids or accumulation of bases can increase hydrogen or decrease hydrogen concentrations, raising the pH and causing alkalosis. Now, there's different types of acidosis and alkalosis. There's respiratory versus metabolic. And so what's the difference? Well, respiratory starts with breathing being affected, right? So essentially, here, let me start with respiratory. You can't breathe. You have a blockage, something's happened, you just can't breathe. Well, if you remember, CO2 is being basically enacted in your body through metabolism. So if you stop breathing, your body can't release CO2 through your lungs. So you're going to get an accumulation of acids and a loss of bases in your blood. That's going to increase the pH and lead to respiratory acidosis. The same if you are breathing rapidly. Deep, quick, rapidly. Essentially, you're going to decrease the amount of hydrogens there. That essentially will lead to a rise of pH and respiratory alkalosis. Now, this can be confusing when we get to the next one. That's pretty straightforward. People are like, okay, respiratory acidosis and alkalosis makes sense, right? The difference between that and metabolic is talking about how your body is essentially creating these conditions due to the molecules it's making. So say, for instance, you have metabolic acidosis. It's going to be like this, right? Metabolic acidosis essentially can come from a few things. You're breaking down a lot of essentially molecules. Maybe you're running and you don't normally do that, and so you're making a lot of CO2. You could be making ketones if you're going with ketosis in some form, but essentially what's happening is you're building up acids and you're going into acidosis. And what this is going to do, it's going to trigger a change in breathing or respiration. So if you have metabolic acidosis, it's going to be something in your body that activates acids to be made, and that's going to change your breathing rates. People get this confused because the respiratory acidosis and alkalosis has to do with what's causing the acidosis and alkalosis, not what your body responds with. And so down here, if it's causing alkalosis in your body, right? And so you are decreasing H and you get into this situation, this is going to slow breathing. The less CO2 you're breathing out, the more your pH will remain acidic. So that's how acidosis and alkalosis are regulated. So just remember, a lot of times acidosis, respiratory right here, essentially can cause from a decrease in ventilation, right? Something's happened, something's blocked it, and this is going to cause the concentration of carbon dioxide in your blood to basically increase, and that's going to cause your pH to drop. Alkalosis is the opposite. So respiratory starts with basically affecting respiration first. Metabolic is essentially happening due to your body. So this could be maybe the kidneys aren't removing enough acid from the body, or something's happening with, like I gave you the example working out. So it's going to compensate using your respiration to help the pH change into something that's neutral. So you have kidney disease, which leads to your kidneys not removing hydrogen, leading to an increase of plasma pH and an increase of respiration. This is an example of respiratory acidosis, true or false. This should be false, right? Kidney is not removing enough hydrogens, right? So, or is it? Yeah, this is false because it doesn't make any sense, right? So let's see, we are not removing enough hydrogens, right? So hydrogen concentration is increasing. So basically increasing of plasma pH. So this is what makes it wrong. So this is basically a trick question. I'll promise you that in the actual test there aren't any trick questions like this. I just wanted to make you think, because it wouldn't increase plasma. Not removing enough hydrogens, right, would decrease your plasma pH, which meant that you would have an acid, right? And having an asthma would increase respiration. But this part right here was a big, you should have went, that doesn't make any sense at all. So if you would have put decreasing pH, then it would be true. Yeah, I can be a turd, can't I? So that's it for this section. And I hope this helped clear up anything you had. And I will see you guys later.